Hey everyone, welcome to today's session on mistakes in economics debates for WUDC 2026. Few disclaimers at the top. First is this is not an exhaustive list of mistakes. Of course, there are many more mistakes that people make in general in debating, but also specifically in economics debates as well. I tried to cover what I think are the top five mistakes. Again, your experiences may be different from mine, but I do think that there is a benefit in learning about these mistakes, but more importantly, as to how to rectify these mistakes, because I think that rectifying these mistakes will help you in general to build stronger cases in economics debates and also build stronger rebuttals and in general contributions within economics debates. That's the first thing to note. The second thing is within this session, I'm going to focus on not just the mistakes, but also as to how to not make them. And when I'm covering the second part, I want you to really pay attention because that is what is going to help you construct good cases, give good analysis, and so on. So, yeah, without further ado, let's just dive into the economics mistakes that we are all here for. The first one is something that you've probably heard either as a feedback or you've given it as a feedback to someone else when you're judging, or you've just noticed it within an economics debate when you were debating, which is people tend to use economics terms without explanation or illustration. And I'm not a fan of that. Most judges are not a fan of that. I, obviously, coming from an economics background, I've worked in economics, I have a postgraduate degree in economics. I probably understand economics more than most people, even within debating. But even then, even if I am your judge, don't just throw around a term and expect me to be content with that. Don't just say, oh, countries have comparative advantages. Let's say we're talking about a trade debate, right? And then you say, oh, countries have comparative advantages. Please tell me what having a comparative advantage means within the context of the debate. Take an example of a particular country. Maybe take the example of a country like Nigeria, which has a comparative advantage when it comes to natural resources. Maybe you want to take the comparative advantage of, say, a country like the United States of America, which has a comparative advantage when it comes to technology. Whatever it is, give me an illustration, give me an explanation, and then talk about why that illustration or why that explanation is relevant within the context of the debate. Don't just throw around the term willy nilly. Like, it can be comparative advantage. It can be like supply demand dynamics leading to, say, some form of competitiveness within a particular industry. Whatever it is, you need to explain what those supply dynamics are, what those demand dynamics are, and break it down in a way such that the average intelligent person can understand. Imagine you're speaking and imagine you are, say, writing a newspaper that thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people consume every day. In those circumstances, will you just say, oh, the supply and demand dynamics means that there is no growth within this industry? No, you wouldn't say that. You would explain what exactly those supply dynamics are. You would explain what exactly those demand dynamics are. And then you would try to explain why that leads to not that high of a growth within a particular industry. And that's how you essentially do debating as well. You don't just say supply demand, you just don't just say comparative advantage. You explain what those are. Obviously, one of the issues when it comes to this is when it comes to economics in specific, oftentimes people don't know how much to explain, and that can be a difficult and scary part to figure out. A good rule of thumb when it comes to this is, say, for example, you are explaining comparative advantage, right? And then you're talking about how comparative advantage can lead to a country being very competitive in a particular sector or a particular industry. When you sort of look at this in general, you'll see that you've used the term comparative advantage, you've used competitiveness, and you've used, obviously, the non-economic term, which is country. If you can illustrate how these are all connected and paint a picture as to what this means, that is a good indication that you have explained it to a fullest extent. I do not expect you, for example, in those particular instances, say, for example, you're explaining comparative advantage and you say Nigeria has natural resources. I don't necessarily want you to explain what exactly those natural resources are. How did they get these natural resources? How can they use those natural resources? I want you to just briefly explain. Okay, Nigeria has petroleum, for example, and petroleum is a commodity that is wanted by a huge segment of the world because it's used in, transportation, it's used in energy production, and so on. And that's it. That's all you have to do. You don't have to explain how this export-import process works or anything else. You just have to explain in this particular instance what you exactly mean by comparative advantage. What is the context of the country you're talking about in terms of comparative advantage? And that's pretty much it, right? So obviously, in a lot of these circumstances, you have to use your own sort of common sense, your own instincts when it comes to how much to explain. But I want you to at least attempt to explain these terms in a way such that people can understand them. I also understand that with economics, you might even be saying something along the lines of, oh, I don't even know these terms myself properly. How can I explain them? For that, I think obviously this is not probably the session for you. If you're struggling with economics in general, I would highly recommend maybe go through another economics debating session online. I have one which is simplifying economics, where I do go through a few economics terms that I did for UADC. You might want to have a look at that. But just generally, other than that, I think this is a problem that I've seen people struggle with, even if you haven't struggled with it. Just know that regardless of whether or not you have struggled with it, every time you use an economics term, please explain it to an extent. Please give examples and illustrations. So that's the first mistake. Second one is something that a lot of people ignore in certain circumstances, which is ignoring preconditions. And this is to a certain extent linked with terms as well. What do I mean? Because this is just two words, right? What do I mean by ignoring preconditions? In economics, you will often see people say, oh, free trade leads to competition. Competition leads to lower prices. And then lower prices benefits consumers, without understanding that all of these things have at least some level of preconditions attached to them. What do I mean by this? Free trade can only lead competition if countries in question are competitive within a particular industry. What do I mean by this? If there is free trade between countries and one country, and say we're talking about a trading bloc, right? Say in Latin America or Africa or any other continent, and there are, say, 5 or 6 countries. If only one country is good at a particular thing, that particular thing may not be very competitive. Let's say, hypothetically, there are 6 countries that we're talking about. Only one of them has petroleum and they're trading amongst each other. Obviously, that country can then hike the prices of petroleum, and there wouldn't be any competition for that particular industry. But then maybe we're not talking about that. Maybe we're talking about certain generic goods. Maybe we're talking about, say, soft drinks or clothes or anything of that sort, where free trade means that countries can trade amongst each other. Maybe 2 or 3 of them have, all of them produce clothes. And because all of them produce clothes, there is competition between the companies that exist within these countries. And when countries abide by laws of free trade, they don't impose tariffs on each other to a large extent, which leads to then there being competition within equal grounds, and then that leads to lowering prices, because if you're competing against each other, you want to offer the customer lower prices so that you can capture market share, right? Even in those circumstances, there's still a few preconditions attached to them. And what are those preconditions? Those preconditions are that, okay, we're talking about these 6 countries. Are these 6 countries proximate with each other? Because if not, then shipping might give one country an advantage over the other. Okay, if shipping is not that huge of a deal, or if you can explain that for this particular industry, maybe shipping is not that much big of a deal, because shipping has been pretty easy generally, so to speak. Like, right now in the world, if you wanted to export something from Vietnam all the way to the United States, you probably can, because shipping routes have been quite advanced, shipping technology has been quite advanced, and also supply chains have been automated, and so many improvements have happened, right? If these things are indeed true, then you can continue on to, okay, how does competition occur within these particular companies? And then how does this then benefit the end consumer? The end consumer is benefited if they have options and if they can pick between them. And when they have options, obviously, oftentimes they will end up choosing the cheapest option, obviously to a certain extent, depending on the quality. And in those areas, the companies will compete against each other. And it so happens that when it comes to free trade, there are more countries, and more countries means more companies, and more companies means more competition in those particular instances for the end consumer. Again, I'm not saying this is exhaustive at all. What I'm saying is, rather than saying the first thing that I said, which was, oh, comparative advantage, sorry, not competitive advantage. Free trade leads to more competition. More competition leads to better quality and cost for consumers, and end consumers are benefited. Rather than that, you have explained properly what the preconditions of competitiveness are in this particular case, what are the preconditions for quality, cost, and so on. And the thing is, I'm saying this for the very, very sort of, rudimentary concept of free trade and competitions and so on. This is true for literally anything. Like if you say, for example, I think there was debate that I once did, which was about like the rising oil prices and why you should we should either support that or oppose that, something of that sort. And in that, there was an argument about rising oil prices contributing to inflation. And now a lot of people know that rising oil prices do contribute to inflation, but how does that exactly occur? And what are the preconditions for inflation? Because a lot of countries, the way in which they measure inflation is through a basket of goods, right? They have a basket of goods and they determine that if the prices of those goods rise, then they will take a particular percentage of that rise and then overall determine what the overall rise in prices were. And for you to tell the audience that rising oil prices will contribute to inflation, you have to explain how rising oil prices contributes to some of the bigger sort of, items on that basket. And some of the bigger items on that basket are things like food, are things like clothes. How does rising oil prices contribute to the increase in price of clothes and goods and so on? Because that is the precondition for you to explain inflation in this particular context. So you have to ask yourself in any economics debate, what conclusion am I going for? And then what are the preconditions for those conclusions? Because oftentimes I see people jump into that conclusion, even sometimes even explain how that conclusion works and how it goes about, but ignoring preconditions. The preconditions are incredibly important. You cannot just say, oh, in the 1990s or whatever, I probably cannot put a date on it, oil prices rose, that led to inflation. Great example. Not adequate explanation, though. Not adequate explanation. You need to explain exactly what are the preconditions of inflation and how rising oil prices contributes to those preconditions, and therefore explain the argument. So this is a good way of analyzing arguments, but this is something that I've seen happen a lot within economics debates. The third one, this is something that is very important within economics debates, which is incentives and capacity have to go hand in hand, specifically when you're talking about actors like government or companies, or even individuals making certain choices, which is that there are two things in economics that are very, very important. For an actor to do something, for a stakeholder to do something, they need to have A, the incentive, and B, the capacity to be able to do it. For example, if you're talking about a government doing something, say, for example, subsidizing a particular industry, first, do they have the incentive to do that? By that, I mean, if the government is democratic, do they have a democratic incentive to do this? Is this going to be popular? Are the people going to take it particularly well? What are the ramifications of doing this? Okay, let's say there is an incentive. Do they have the money to do this? Is this government particularly fiscally stressed? Like, is this government going through a debt crisis in any way whatsoever? Is this government fighting through an aging population and therefore is concerned about how it's going to fund welfare for its aging population, where the working population is shrinking and they don't have much money to extract tax from? It can be a whole host of things. But the point is that the two things you need to describe whenever you're saying stakeholder X is going to do Y is, does stakeholder X have the incentive to do Y? And does stakeholder X have the capacity to do Y? And oftentimes you can give multiple incentives and multiple ways in which you demonstrate capacity. And that's how you get a complete analysis when it comes to stakeholders within economics debates. Far too often, I see teams doing one of them or neither of them. And that's bad news. I want you and I need you to do both to explain well within the economics debate. The fourth one is forgetting opportunity cost and trade-offs. There are some times that I see that there will be a debate where the topic is going to be this house would do X. And X is usually a good thing. And I've seen this in Australs where I was seeing, and it's kind of sounded like it's a good thing. Obviously, there was a good balanced debate on it. But the motion was this house believes that the government should subsidize friendship, which in general sounds like, a good thing to do. But whenever the government chooses to subsidize something or do something, it means that there is an opportunity cost and a trade-off towards something else. If the government is indeed subsidizing something like friendship, then it is probably not doing something else. Like if it is, say, building areas where friendships can form, or subsidizing or giving people money to actively form friendships, or subsidizing areas or restaurants and stuff where people can go and actually have social gatherings, etc., it probably isn't able to do something else. And what is that something else? Don't make the debate about, oh, it means that they're going to take money from education, healthcare, or whatever. You need to explain to me why is it that when a government, if they are prompted to do something, this is the first thing that they pull money from. See what the evidence suggests. See what evidence suggests when it comes to particular countries having to fund something where they take the money from first, and then explain within those debates. This is a homework for you guys if you're listening so far, which is figure out. This is not going to be easy at all. Figure out what governments do when they are faced with extra expenses. And what do they do in those circumstances? Do they pull out money from welfare? Do they pull out money from the military? Do they pull out money from education, healthcare? Do they take on more debt? What do they do? By the way, oftentimes the answer is take on more debt. And as op, you can always argue that that's probably a bad thing. And there's a whole host of reasons that's a bad thing. But the point is, this is important because whenever I see a prop team arguing, oh, this is a good thing, we should just do it, they often ignore what the opportunity costs and trade-offs are. And if you can say, look, we understand maybe for this we need to take government debt. Here we're going to explain why this is worth it. You can even go out and say, we're going to take away money from the funding of, say, psychological health. Why? Because we think that by promoting friendship, by making sure that people are more social, we actually reduce our long-term costs on psychological health and so on. Because people have, government subsidize psychological health where they pay for psychologists, they pay for therapists and so on. If this is indeed true, then if it is also true that friendship and subsidizing friendship leads to better psychological and mental health outcomes for people, then we can justify taking away money from that particular department. And if you can make that argument, for example, your case will sound so much more persuasive because you have not forgotten the opportunity cost and the trade-off of doing something. Whenever you're doing anything within economics debate, there's always an opportunity cost, there's always a trade-off. Please identify what that is and then justify it. And if your opponents bring that up, make sure that you rebut it really well, because otherwise there might be an OG that comes up and says, this is a great thing, let's just do it. O doesn't say much. CO comes up and says, here's the trade-off. And OG never really responded to the trade-off. And OG automatically will, I wouldn't say automatically, obviously depends on the context of the debate, but there's a high chance because CO pointed out a particular trade-off and OG never really explained what happens when it comes to a trade-off, that OG really ends up losing to CO. And you don't want to be the opening government, right? You want to be the opening government that acknowledges the trade-off, understands it, analyzes it, and also says why it is justified regardless of the opportunity cost and the trade-off. So don't forget that. The last one is forgetting distributional impacts. I see this all too often as well. And this is sort of a bit different from some of the other mistakes that I've talked about. Oftentimes I'll see a particular team going ahead and say, oh, and then this is why the economy then grows because of this, or this is why, you have more GDP within a particular country. You have more economic activity within a particular country, which, by the way, means the same thing. More GDP and more economic activity within the country means the same thing. You have to explain why that actually benefits people. Because the obvious rebuttal that I've seen oftentimes is, sure, this increases GDP, but the benefits of that increase in GDP is concentrated within a few people. It never really reaches the most vulnerable populations, the poor populations, and so on. Even if it is an explanation of, here's how a group of people get money, they then spend it, which you have to obviously explain. Okay, this group of money, are they like middle class, upper middle class? What do they spend it on? Even if they spend it on something like a restaurant, and it creates more demand for restaurants. And then if it does create a demand for restaurants, then service people are employed within those restaurants. Now, more people are being employed within those restaurants. These people then go out and say, spend more money behind more sort of necessary services like food, recreation, and so on, which creates an entire new industry. Whatever it is, please explain some level of distributional impacts from your economic growth argument. Because oftentimes I see people just explaining economic growth and just leaving it at, oh, this creates economic growth. Great. So what? How does this help people? And bear in mind, this is not a bad argument. Economic growth has lifted millions and millions of people out of poverty. You just need to be aware of what the mechanism is when it comes to that. How does that mechanism work? And how does, for example, economic growth lead to lifting people out of poverty. And how does that happen? And in those circumstances, when GDP growth happens, when people have more income, is it that, for example, governments have more tax revenue, and more tax revenue means a greater ability to have welfare? Or even if it's not greater ability to have welfare, is it greater ability to have infrastructure, like building roads between regions, that those were the regions that were underserved? And when you build, say, for example, roads between those regions, then the economy of those areas flourish, because roads means more connectivity. More connectivity means more economic activity, and more economic activity means more jobs. More jobs means more spending power. Whatever it is, however way you want to link the distributional impact of economic growth or your economic growth argument, do it. Make sure that any economics argument is tied to the benefit of the layperson, the average person, the poor person, people who are living in poverty. Connect it to it. I don't really mind if the argument is a bit more, say, progressive in nature economically, if it's a bit more conservative in nature economically. Whatever it is, please connect to how it's going to improve the lives of real people, because you cannot be forgetting distributional impacts of your arguments. They exist, identify them, analyze them, and yeah, basically make sure that you really are able to explain how those distributional impacts occur. So yeah, those were the top 5 mistakes that I've seen in economics debates. Hopefully, this was helpful for you guys. If you guys have any questions by any chance, you might want to leave a comment in the YouTube video. I might be checking it maybe once a month and trying to answer your questions if you have any. But yeah, as I said, on economics debates in general, you could look for other sessions. Specifically, I have some of my sessions as well. So yeah, thank you for watching, and have a great Worlds. And my best wishes to everyone participating at WUDC 2026. Best wishes to the Edge Core as well. I love the people in the Edge Core WUDC 2026. I hope you guys will have a great one.